She couldn't feel her hands anymore. Maggie Colton hung from the windmill post, with her wrists bound so tight, the rope had long since cut through skin, and she had stopped praying for rescue an hour ago. She had started praying for it to be quick. Then she heard hoofbeats. If this story of a woman who lost everything and still chose to fight speaks to your heart, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow every part of this story to the very end. And leave me a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The windmill hadn't turned in 3 days. That was the first thing Maggie Colton noticed when Victor Drake's men dragged her out of the ranch house at 4 in the morning, that the windmill was perfectly still, like even the Wyoming wind had decided to hold its breath and witness what was about to happen to her. She didn't scream. She had learned 6 years ago that screaming only made Victor smile. They tied her to the center post with a length of rough hemp rope, looping it 3 times around her wrists, and knotting it behind the wooden beam so she couldn't reach the binding with her fingers. The man who did it, a thick-necked hand named Cutter, who smelled of tobacco and old cruelty, yanked the knot so hard her shoulders wrenched and her vision went white. "That ought to hold you till the boss decides what he wants done," Cutter said. Maggie said nothing. The sun was barely a suggestion on the eastern horizon when they rode away and left her there. By the time it climbed fully into the sky, the post at her back had turned into a branding iron. July in Wyoming Territory did not negotiate with human suffering. She thought about water first. Then she thought about Lillian, her older sister asleep 2 miles away in the boarding house in Cutter Creek, who did not know where Maggie was and would not know to look until morning. Then she thought about the ledger. The ledger she had hidden inside the false bottom of the flour tin 3 weeks ago. The one with Victor Drake's handwriting across 47 pages. The one that documented every fraudulent land transfer, every bribed official, every name of every man in Cutter Creek who had taken Victor's money and looked the other way while women disappeared. That ledger was the reason she was tied to this windmill. She had made one mistake. One. She had trusted the wrong person with the knowledge that she had it. Maggie pulled against the rope. Not because she believed she could break it. She was 25 years old and lean from years of hard ranch work. But hemp rope at 3 loops was not something arms could argue with. But because she was not the kind of woman who stopped trying simply because something looked impossible. Her father had taught her that. Her father, whose land Victor Drake had stolen through, forged deed signatures 2 years after his death, while Maggie was still too grief-stunned to read the documents properly. She had read them afterward. She had read them until she had memorized every fraudulent word. The sun climbed higher. She was on her 3rd attempt to work some slack into the rope when she heard it a sound so incongruous with her circumstances that for a moment she thought the heat was manufacturing it. Hoofbeats. Single rider moving at a canter, not the aggressive gallop of Drake's men coming back for her. Deliberate pace, unhurried. She turned her head as far as she could and saw him come over the ridge. Tall man on a dark horse. He sat the saddle the way men do when riding is as natural to them as breathing. No performance in it. No showing off, just a body that had spent so many years on horseback. That ground was the thing that felt unnatural. He wore a dark brown hat pulled low against the morning glare, a light shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a brown vest that had seen considerable weather. He carried a revolver on his hip the way working men carried tools not for display. He stopped at the edge of the windmill's shadow and looked at her. Maggie looked back at him. She did not beg. She would not beg in front of a stranger, not even now, not even tied to a post in the July heat with her wrists bleeding. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even, like water over stone. "I would appreciate some assistance," Maggie said. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. She was proud of that. The man stepped down from the horse in one smooth motion. He covered the distance between them at a walk, pulled a folding knife from his vest pocket, and examined the knot at her wrists without touching it yet. "Victor Drake's work?" he asked. The question surprised her. "His men's work. How do you know that name? I've ridden 3 counties asking about him." He opened the blade. "Hold still." He cut the rope in 2 careful motions, working the blade between the hemp and her skin with a precision that told her he'd done this kind of thing before, cut rope from wrists without adding to the damage already done. When the binding fell away, her arms dropped and the pain of returning circulation hit her so hard she buckled. He caught her, one arm around her shoulders solid and immediate, no hesitation. "Slow," he said. "Give it a minute." She wanted to tell him she was fine. She was not fine. She let him hold her weight for exactly as long as it took for her legs to remember their purpose. Then she straightened and stepped back. "Thank you," she said. "I need to get to Cutter Creek." "You need water first." He was already moving back to the horse, pulling a canteen from the saddlebag. He brought it back and held it out, not handing it over as if she were helpless, just offering it the way you offer anything necessary to a person who needs it. She took it and drank without ceremony. "Garrett Hayes," he said. "I work a spread up near the Montana line. Or I did." "Maggie Colton." She handed the canteen back. "What brings a Montana rancher to Cutter Creek asking about Victor Drake?" Something shifted in his face. It wasn't grief exactly. It was the face of a man who had already done his grieving and was now operating on the other side of it, in the territory where grief becomes something colder and more purposeful. "My sister," he said, "Ruth Hayes. She came to Cutter Creek 2 years ago to work at the hotel. Victor Drake took an interest in her." He paused. "She died 8 months later. The official account said it was fever." Maggie looked at him steadily. "It wasn't fever." "No." His jaw tightened once. "It wasn't." She understood then why he had been riding 3 counties. She understood the particular quality of the stillness in him, not the stillness of a peaceful man, but the stillness of a man who had decided something and was carrying that decision the way you carry a stone in your chest always. "Victor Drake has done this before," she said. "More than once, more than you know." "Tell me." She told him. They rode into the shadow of a rocky outcrop 1/2 mile from the windmill, and Maggie talked while Garrett watered his horse and listened without interrupting, which she immediately recognized as a rarer quality in a man than most women over 30 could afford to believe. She told him about her father, James Colton, who had ranched the eastern parcel for 22 years and died of a bad winter and a worse heart when Maggie was 18. She told him about the will which left the ranch to Maggie and her sister Lillian jointly, and about how Victor Drake had appeared at the funeral with condolences and casseroles and a patience that she understood now was the patience of a predator who had already chosen his moment. She told him about the marriage, Victor's proposal, her initial refusal, and the 2 months of escalating pressure that followed, during which Drake's men began making small disasters on Colton land, a fence down here, a water supply contaminated there. One of the horses found dead in the south pasture, with no explanation. She told him how Lillian, who was 30 and cautious and had seen more of how the world worked than Maggie at 22, had sat her down at the kitchen table and said very quietly, "I think we need to reconsider." "You married him," Garrett said. "It wasn't a question." "I married him." She said it the way you say a thing you have carried long enough that the weight of it has become familiar. "I thought I could manage it. I thought if I was careful enough, smart enough, I could find a way out on my terms." She paused. "I was wrong about how long it would take." "What changed?" "I found the ledger." She watched a hawk ride a thermal above the ridge. 6 months ago. Victor keeps his legitimate accounts in the main office, his fraudulent ones in a locked strongbox under the floorboards of the guest room. He didn't know I had a key made 3 years ago from a wax impression. She glanced at Garrett. "I'm very good with numbers. I always have been. My father taught me the books before I could ride." Something that might have been the beginning of respect moved across Garrett's face. "What's in it?" 47 pages. Land transfers going back 12 years, all forged. He's taken 11 properties in this county alone, all from families who encountered sudden difficulties after refusing to sell. 2 of the men who refused are dead. The official accounts said accidents. She let that settle. He has a partner, a man named Colonel Aldous Shaw, who sits on the Territorial Land Board. Shaw processes the fraudulent transfers and accepts payment. Victor's been building himself a land empire for over a decade, and he's had the machinery of the county government helping him do it. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Where's the ledger now? Hidden at the ranch, in a flour tin. She pressed her lips together. Or it was. If Victor's men found it during the night, did they go into the house? They came for me in the house, but they moved fast. They weren't searching. Victor sent them for me specifically. He must have just found out I have it, probably within the last day. She thought it through. He wouldn't have sent men to drag me to a windmill if he'd already recovered the ledger. He'd have been calmer. He would have confronted me directly and made me hand it over. Her voice stayed flat. Victor does his worst work in private. Public spectacles make him nervous. Then the ledger might still be there. It might. She looked at him. The ranch house is Drake land now, legally the deed's in his name. I have no right to enter it. You have as much right as any person who knows where stolen property is hidden, Garrett said, with a simplicity that made it sound like the most obvious thing in the world. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Mr. Hayes, she said, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Why are you helping me? You came here for your sister's justice. That's a personal account. I'm a stranger with a complicated situation and a dangerous husband. You could ride back to Montana and be none the worse for it. He looked at her without evasion. His dark eyes were steady and entirely serious. My sister died alone, he said. In a town where everybody knew what Victor Drake was and nobody said a word. I can't change that, but I can decide what I do about it going forward. He paused. And I reckon a woman tied to a post in July heat isn't something I ride past. Maggie nodded once. All right then. They reached Cutter Creek before noon. It was a town that looked respectable from a distance, two-story buildings along the main street, a proper courthouse with a painted sign, a hotel with clean windows, a church with a bell that actually worked. The kind of town that wore its corruption the way some people wore their finest clothes to be seen from far enough away that the seams didn't show. Garrett rode slightly behind and to the right of Maggie, which positioned him to see any threat from that side before she did. She noticed this without commenting on it. It was not the posture of a man who thought she needed protecting. It was the posture of a man who had learned how to watch a perimeter. They stopped in front of Harlan's boarding house, a wide porched building on the edge of the main street, where Lillian Colton had taken a room 4 months ago after Maggie had quietly insisted that her sister not sleep under Victor Drake's roof any longer. Lillian was on the porch. She was standing with her arms crossed, which was how Lillian stood when she was afraid and was trying not to show it. She was 32 years old, darker-haired than Maggie, and slightly taller, with the particular expression of a woman who had been awake all night running through worst-case possibilities and had landed on several. She saw Maggie, and her arms dropped. The relief that crossed her face was brief, and immediately followed by the narrowing of her eyes that meant she had already begun calculating what must have happened and what it would require. Her gaze moved to Garrett. She assessed him in approximately 4 seconds. Maggie had seen her sister do this with people her whole life and had never once seen her assessment proven wrong. Who is this? Lillian said. Garrett Hayes, Maggie said. He cut me loose from Victor's windmill this morning. He's here about his sister Ruth. Something changed in Lillian's face at that name. Come inside, she said. Both of you. Inside, Lillian put coffee on without being asked. Not because she was a woman who defaulted to domestic tasks under pressure, but because her hands needed something to do, and coffee was useful. Maggie sat at the table and let Garrett take the chair nearest the door, which he did naturally facing out. Victor came by here at 6 this morning, Lillian said, keeping her back to them while she worked the stove. 2 men with him. He asked if I'd seen you. I told him no, which was true then. She turned. He smiled when I said it. That slow smile he does when he already knows something you don't. She set 3 cups down with careful precision. What happened? Maggie told her. All of it, including the ledger. Lillian was quiet through the whole account. This was not because she was shocked Lillian had stopped being shocked by Victor Drake approximately 2 years ago, but because she was listening with the totality of her attention, assembling the information into a structure she could work with. "The ledger is still in the tin," she said when Maggie finished. "If he hasn't sent someone to search." "He hasn't." Lillian sat down. "He came here first. He's still in the information gathering stage, trying to figure out what you know, who you've told, how much danger he's actually in. That buys us some time." She looked at Garrett. "You said you've been asking about him across 3 counties. What have you found?" "Enough to know he's insulated himself well," Garrett said. "The county sheriff is on his payroll. The land board official Shaw is his partner. The judge in the last county over owes Drake a debt I haven't been able to quantify yet. He's built a structure that makes coming at him through official channels nearly impossible." He paused. "Nearly." "Nearly," Lillian repeated. "What's the exception?" "The territorial court in Cheyenne. It's above Drake's reach. If you can get evidence to the right judge, their evidence that documents the land fraud and the bribery, you bypass every local official he owns." He looked between the sisters. "But it has to be airtight. A man with Drake's resources will have lawyers who can pick apart anything with a gap in it." "The ledger has no gaps," Maggie said. "I've read it 47 times. His own handwriting, his own figures, the names of every bribed official. It's a complete record." She paused. "What we're missing is testimony. A witness who experienced what I experienced, who can stand up in that courtroom and describe what Victor Drake does to people who get in his way." A silence fell over the room. Then Garrett said very quietly, "I know someone." Both sisters looked at him. "There's a woman in Laramie," he said. "Her name now is Sarah Brennan. When she came to Cutter Creek, her name was Anna Hart. She worked at the hotel same time as Ruth." His voice stayed even, but Maggie could hear what it cost him. "She got out. Ruth didn't. Sarah Brennan has been living under a different name for 18 months because she's been afraid to speak." He met Maggie's eyes. "She told me when I found her last month that she would speak if she believed it would actually reach a court that Drake couldn't control. She'd come," Maggie said. "She'd come if she knew there was a real chance. If she knew it wouldn't just end up buried in a county courthouse with a judge Drake already owns." Lillian looked at her sister. Maggie looked back at her. 6 years of a forced marriage. 6 years of counting her steps and measuring her words and keeping her rage below the surface, where it wouldn't get her killed. 6 years of watching a man use the machinery of law and money to take everything from everyone around him while the town watched and the county officials pocketed their payments, and the women who could have spoken instead disappeared, or went silent, or died of things officially called fever. "We get the ledger," Maggie said. "We get Sarah Brennan to Cutter Creek, and then we take every piece of evidence we have and we put it in front of a judge that Victor Drake has never met and cannot buy." She said it with the quietness of a decision that has been building for years and has finally found its moment to surface. "We end this." Garrett looked at her across the table. Something in his expression not quite admiration, but the particular recognition one person feels upon discovering another person is made of the same material as themselves, settled into place. "All right," he said. "Then we'd better start tonight." Outside the windmill on the edge of town had begun to turn at last. The wind had come back to Wyoming, and Maggie Colton, for the first time in 6 years, did not feel afraid. That night came slow and hot. The kind of July dark that doesn't bring relief, just trades the sun's cruelty for a different kind of stillness that presses down on everything and everyone underneath it. Maggie hadn't slept. She hadn't tried. She sat at Lillian's small table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside her hand, running through the layout of the ranch house. In her mind, the way she had run through it 1,000 times over 6 years. Every floorboard that creaked, every door that stuck in summer heat, every window latch that could be worked from outside if you knew the angle. She knew them all. She had learned them the way a prisoner learns the walls of a cell, not for comfort, but for survival. Garrett came in from the back just after midnight. He moved quietly for a man his size, which she was already beginning to understand, was less about stealth and more about a general disposition toward not taking up more space than necessary. A quality she found given everything almost startling in its rarity. "Cutter's still in town," he said, meaning the thick-necked hand who'd tied her to the windmill. "Saw him drinking at the saloon an hour ago. He'll be there till close." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Two men at the ranch house, front and back. Victor's at the hotel. He took a room there tonight instead of riding back to the main house." Maggie looked up. "He never stays in town." "He does when he's nervous." Garrett said it plainly. "He doesn't want to be alone at the ranch tonight. Men like Drake, they do their damage in positions of strength. When that shifts, they get cautious." "He thinks I'm still tied to that windmill," she said. "Probably found out by now that you're not." "Which makes him more nervous." She wrapped her hands around the cold cup. "Good. Nervous men make mistakes." Lillian came out of the back room, pulling her dark hair back with a practicality that meant she had already made her decision and was now operating inside it. She looked at Garrett. "The two guards, can they be managed without shooting?" "Managed," Garrett said with a tone that was neither confirmation nor refusal. "Depends on how smart they are." "Victor doesn't hire smart men," Maggie said. "He hires loyal men. There's a difference." "Loyal men are predictable," Garrett said. "That helps." Lillian sat down. The three of them looked at each other across the table in the particular way of people who have arrived at a point where the talking is mostly done and what remains is the doing. "I need to be the one who goes in," Maggie said. Garrett didn't argue. He simply said, "I'll be outside." It was such a clean and uncomplicated statement of position. Not, "I'll protect you." Not, "Are you sure about this?" Not the particular brand of masculine hesitation that dresses itself as concern, while actually being about control. That Maggie felt something in her chest loosen slightly, like a knot that had been pulled so tight for so long, she'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. "I'll go around to Harlan's wife," Lillian said. "Ellen Harlan has known about Victor for 2 years. She'll give me an alibi if anyone comes asking tonight." She met Maggie's eyes. "Be fast." "I'm always fast," Maggie said. The ranch house sat half a mile outside town, and Maggie knew every inch of the path in the dark without needing to think about it. Her feet remembered. Some knowledge lives in the body rather than the mind, and 6 years of moving through that property at all hours early mornings to check the livestock before Victor woke late nights to avoid being noticed had made the ground itself familiar to her. Garrett moved parallel to her through the scrub brush close enough that she could track his position by sound far enough that if someone spotted her, he was a separate shadow and not an obvious companion. The guard at the back was young. She could tell from his posture that particular restlessness of a man who doesn't entirely understand why he's standing where he's standing or what he's actually guarding against. He kept shifting his weight. He looked at the sky once, which told her his mind was somewhere else. She didn't need Garrett to handle him. She walked out of the dark and straight up to him like she owned the property because 6 years ago she had, and some part of her had decided to walk like that again, starting now. "Evening," she said. The guard startled so hard he nearly dropped his rifle. "Mrs. Drake, what you're supposed to be." "I'm supposed to be what?" Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. "This is my house. I need something from inside. You can either step aside or explain to Mr. Drake tomorrow why you pointed a gun at his wife on the property he told you to guard." She paused. "Your choice." He stepped aside. She walked through the back door into the kitchen, through the hall without lighting a lamp straight to the guest room at the end of the east corridor. The floorboard she needed was the third one from the window slightly off color. Victor had never noticed because he had never looked, which was the foundational error of every powerful man she had ever observed, the absolute certainty that no one was paying attention at a level of detail finer than his own. She pried it up with her thumbnail and a thin-bladed knife she'd borrowed from Garrett's vest pocket. The flour tin was still there. She pulled it out, opened the false bottom, and closed her hand around the ledger. 47 pages. Victor Drake's handwriting. Every name. Every amount. every property. She stood up, put the tin back, replaced the floorboard, and walked back out through the kitchen. The young guard was still standing where she'd left him, trying to look like he'd made a decision, rather than had one made for him. "Good night," Maggie said, and walked back into the dark. Garrett materialized beside her 15 seconds later. "You didn't need me," he said. "Not for that part." She was already moving back toward town. "I'll need you for the part that comes next." He matched her pace. "What part is that?" "Victor will know by morning that the ledger is gone. When that happens, he won't be nervous anymore. He'll be furious, and furious men with money and armed employees are considerably more dangerous than nervous ones." She kept walking. "We have between now and dawn to get word to Sarah Brennan in Laramie. She needs to be on the first stage out." "Stage doesn't run to Laramie until Thursday." "Then we send a rider." She glanced at him. "You have a fast horse." A pause. Then, "I do. I need you to ride to Laramie tonight and tell Sarah Brennan that we have the ledger. We have a path to the territorial court, and that her testimony, her actual account of what happened at that hotel, is the thing that converts a ledger full of numbers into a story that a judge can't ignore." She stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Can you do that?" In the darkness, she could see his face clearly enough. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she was coming to recognize as his version of surprise, which was very different from most people's version because it was so quiet. "You're asking me to leave," he said. "I'm asking you to do the part only you can do. I have the ledger. Lillian has the contacts in Cutter Creek. What I don't have is Sarah Brennan, and she trusts you." She held his gaze. "I know what I'm asking you to give up. Being here when it happens. The confrontation." She paused. "But I need her testimony more than I need another gun." Garrett was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that does its thinking in real time. "She'll come," he said finally. "I'll make sure of it." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small folded paper, a document she hadn't seen him with before. "Before I go, this is a letter from a judge in Cheyenne, Judge Henry Wade. He's Territorial Circuit Court Drake's never had business with him, and I have reason to believe he's clean. I've been carrying that letter for 6 weeks, trying to find enough evidence to justify sending it back to him." He pressed it into her hand. "You've got the evidence now. You know what to do with it." She looked down at the letter, then back up at him. "You planned this further ahead than you told me," she said. "I told you what you needed tonight," he said. "The rest is yours." She wanted to say something. She wasn't sure what. In the end, she said, "Ride fast, Mr. Hayes." "Yes, ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat in that economical way of his, turned, and was gone into the dark before she'd taken 3 steps. She was back at Lillian's boarding room before 2 in the morning, and Lillian took one look at her at the ledger in her hand and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since 6 that morning. "You got it. We got it." Maggie set it on the table. "And Garrett's riding to Laramie tonight for Sarah Brennan." Lillian sat down slowly. She looked at the ledger with an expression Maggie recognized, the same expression their father had worn when he settled a long dispute over land boundaries and the paper was finally signed. Not happiness exactly. More like the particular relief of a thing that has been wrong for a very long time, beginning in some small technical way to move toward right. "We can't keep it here," Lillian said. "No." Maggie picked it back up. "I need to make a copy. I need 2 copies, one for Judge Wade, one to be held by someone in town Victor would never think to threaten." She was already thinking through the possibilities. "Ellen Harlan. Ellen Harlan," Lillian repeated and nodded slowly. "Victor thinks she's just Harlan's wife. He's never taken the trouble to understand that she reads every document that comes through this town and has a mind like a bank vault." She paused. "She also hasn't liked Victor Drake since 1879, when he cheated her husband out of water rights on the South Pasture, and then came to her church social and ate her pie." Despite everything, Maggie almost smiled. "I'll talk to her in the morning. You should sleep first." I'll sleep when Victor Drake is in front of a territorial judge." She was already uncapping the small inkwell on Lillian's desk, pulling out paper, opening the ledger to page 1. "Go to bed, Lillian. I'll wake you before dawn." "I'm not going to bed," Lillian said with the tone of a woman who has made a decision and finds further discussion unnecessary. She pulled her chair to the other side of the desk. "You copy. I'll check your work." So that was how they spent the rest of the night, two sisters at a small desk in a boarding house in Cutter Creek, Wyoming, copying out a dead man's confession in the lamplight, while outside the town slept around its own corruption, like a body that has gotten used to carrying a sickness it doesn't acknowledge. Victor Drake came to the boarding house at 7 in the morning. He didn't knock. He opened the door with the particular force of a man who considers other people's property an extension of his own convenience. Stepped into the front room, and looked at Maggie with an expression she had learned to catalog with great care over 6 years. Because with Victor Drake, the difference between controlled anger and dangerous anger was a matter of calibration. And getting that calibration wrong was the kind of mistake that left marks. This was controlled, but barely. He was a large man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from never having been made to feel small. He was 51 years old and still carried himself like a man who had never lost anything he actually wanted. Dark suit despite the heat. He always wore a dark suit. It was one of the things she had cataloged Victor's performance of his own power, never went off duty. "Good morning, Margaret," he said. Nobody else called her Margaret. She had always understood this was deliberate. "Victor." She was standing in the middle of the room. She had decided last night while she was copying that, when this moment came, she would be standing. She would not be caught sitting. He looked at her wrists. The rope marks were visible. She hadn't tried to cover them. "I heard you had a difficult night," he said, as if they were discussing inconvenient weather. "I want you to know I had no knowledge of what those men did. Cutter overstepped. He's been dealt with." "Cutter did exactly what you told him to do," Maggie said. "You told him to convince me that I was in a position where I had no choices. That was the message." She kept her voice conversational. "It didn't land the way you hoped." Something moved in his eyes, quick and cold. "You're upset. That's understandable. Come home, Margaret. We can discuss whatever's bothering you in private, like." "The ledger is gone, Victor." Silence. It was a particular kind of silence, the kind that a very controlled man produces when the thing he was managing has slipped out of his hands in a way he cannot immediately calculate the full implications of. She watched him process it. She watched him decide in real time whether to deny, deflect, or advance. He advanced, which was what she had expected. Victor always advanced when he was afraid. "I don't know what you think you found," he said quietly. "But I want you to understand something, Margaret. A ledger without context is just numbers. A wife without credibility is just a story. And your credibility in this county—" He let the sentence trail in a direction she was meant to complete for herself. "Is exactly as thin as you've spent 6 years making it," she finished. "I know. I watched you do it. The quiet conversations you had with people, the way you'd mention my difficulties. To anyone who might listen, the suggestion to Dr. Pell that I'd been overwrought since my father died." Her voice stayed even. "It was a thorough job. I'll give you that." "Then you understand." "What I understand," Maggie said, "is that you built those defenses against a county court, against local opinion, against a sheriff on your payroll and a land board official in your pocket." She tilted her head slightly. "You didn't build them against Cheyenne." Victor Drake went very still. It was the stillness of a man who has just recalculated the distance between where he thought he was standing and where he is actually standing, and found the gap to be considerably larger than anticipated. "You have no idea what you're—" "Judge Henry Wade," Maggie said. "Territorial Circuit Court. You've never had business with him, which means you've never had an opportunity to make any of your usual arrangements." She looked at him directly. "The ledger goes to Cheyenne Victor, and Sarah Brennan's testimony goes with it." The name hit him. She saw it. For just a moment, less than a second, something crossed his face that was not anger and not calculation. It was fear. clean and honest and entirely unperformed. He recovered quickly. Men like Victor always recovered quickly. Sarah Brennan is no one. A hysterical woman who survived what my sister-in-law Ruth Hayes did not survive, Maggie said quietly, and who is prepared to say so in front of a judge who cannot be bought. The air in the room had changed. Lillian had appeared in the doorway of the back room. She didn't come forward, just stood there, which was its own kind of statement. Bearing witness. Refusing to be invisible. Victor looked at Lillian, then back at Maggie. The performance of reasonable concern that he'd walked in wearing had fallen away. And what was underneath it was what she had always known was underneath it, a man who had mistaken his impunity for permanence and was only now beginning to grasp that those were different things. "You will not do this," he said, low and hard. And, "I already have," Maggie said. "The copies left this morning. The original is somewhere you will not find it." She took one step toward him, just one, deliberate and unhurried. "You should speak to a lawyer, Victor, a real one, not one of the county men you own." She paused. "This is over." For a moment nothing happened. Then Victor Drake turned and walked out the door. Maggie stood where she was and listened to his footsteps cross the porch. She listened to his horse. She listened until the sound was gone, and even then she waited. Then her knees tried to buckle and she locked them, and she stood. "Maggie!" Lillian was across the room in 3 steps. Her hand on her sister's arm, not holding her up, just present, which was what Lillian had always known how to be. "I'm fine." Maggie's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I know you are." Lillian's hand tightened slightly. "I know." They stood there for a moment, the two of them, in a boarding house room that smelled of coffee and lamp oil and the previous night's work. Outside, Cutter Creek was beginning its morning horses on the street. Someone opening the general store across the way. The ordinary texture of a town that had no idea what had just changed inside one of its unremarkable rooms. "He'll move fast now," Maggie said. "He'll try to discredit me before the word gets to Cheyenne. He'll call in every debt pressure, every contact." "Let him," Lillian said. "We're faster." But she said it with a certainty she was partly manufacturing, and Maggie knew it, and Lillian knew Maggie knew it, and neither of them said so, because sometimes the certainty you perform in front of the people who are counting on you is the thing that carries you until the real certainty arrives. Jato. The real certainty arrived 2 days later in the form of a stage from Laramie. Maggie was at the window of the boarding house when it rolled in. She had been at that window, or some version of it, for most of 48 hours, watching the street with the particular vigilance of a woman who knows the enemy has resources and is not standing still. She saw Garrett step down first. Then she saw the woman behind him. Sarah Brennan was 27 years old and had the look of someone who had survived something that had remade her. Not broken, not diminished, but changed in the way that fire changes metal, which is to say, permanently, and in ways that made her simultaneously more fragile and more hard. She was small and fair-haired and moved with a watchfulness that Maggie recognized immediately because she had spent 6 years moving the same way. Garrett looked up at the boarding house window. He found her face immediately, which told her he'd been looking for it. He gave a single small nod. She was already moving for the door. She came down the steps and stopped on the porch, and Sarah Brennan looked up at her from the street below, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other, taking the full measure of a stranger they both already understood, in the particular way that people understand each other when they have been through the same kind of damage, even if the specifics differ. "Mrs. Drake," Sarah said. "Maggie," Maggie said. "Just Maggie." She came down the last 2 steps. "Thank you for coming." Sarah Brennan looked at her steadily. "He said you had the ledger." "I have the ledger." Something in Sarah's face shifted. Her eyes went bright and then controlled again with an effort that was visible and that Maggie did not look away from, because looking away from someone's effort is a form of disrespect she had never been able to make herself commit. "Then I'll talk," Sarah said. "I'll say everything, every word of it." Her voice was clear and entirely resolved. "I should have said it 18 months ago. I know that, but I'm saying it now." "That's enough," Maggie said. Now is enough. Garrett was standing slightly to the side, giving the two women the space of the moment. He caught Maggie's eye over Sarah's head, and she saw in his face a version of the same thing she had seen on the porch in the dark 2 nights ago. That quiet recognition, that sense of standing in the presence of something that has been set in motion and will not be stopped now. Victor's made his moves, he said quietly, coming forward. I heard in Laramie he sent a rider to the county judge, trying to file an injunction against any evidence I've gathered claiming I've been operating outside my authority, which I have been technically. A pause. But a man with no official authority and a ledger full of documented crimes still beats a man with official protection and nothing but accusations. How long before the injunction comes through? Lillian asked. She had appeared on the porch, having said nothing and seen everything. 3 days, maybe 4, if the county judge moves fast. Garrett looked at Maggie. We need to be in Cheyenne before that. Stage leaves Thursday, Maggie said. Thursday is too late. We ride tomorrow morning. He said it with the same simplicity. He said everything, no drama, no performance. Just the fact of what needed to happen, laid out cleanly. All 4 of us. Maggie looked at Sarah Brennan, who was already nodding. She looked at Lillian, who was already calculating. She looked at Garrett Hayes, who was looking back at her with the steady dark eyes of a man who had ridden 3 counties asking questions for a dead girl, and had ended up here in this specific moment at the start of something that was considerably larger than what he'd come for, and who did not, as far as she could see, consider that a problem. All right, Maggie said. Tomorrow morning. Tonight she would not think about the road ahead, or the injunction, or the judge in Cheyenne, or any of it. Tonight she would sit with Sarah Brennan in Lillian's small room and let Sarah tell her story, the full version, unedited, the one that had been sitting in that woman's chest for 18 months, pressing against her ribs like a stone, and she would listen the way Garrett had listened to her, with the whole of her attention, and without interruption. Because some things need to be said before they can become evidence. They need to be said first, just because they are true, and because someone needs to hear them. The truth was owed a witness. Maggie intended to be one. They rode out before dawn. Maggie had slept 3 hours, which was 3 more than she'd expected. She woke in the dark with her hand already reaching for the ledger she'd placed under the thin boarding house mattress, a reflex so immediate it told her something about what her sleeping mind had been doing all night. It was still there. She pressed her palm flat against it for a moment, feeling the shape of it through the leather cover. 47 pages, a man's crimes written in his own hand. She got up dressed in the dark and did not allow herself to feel anything about what the day ahead might require. Feeling could come later. There would be time for feeling when this was finished. Garrett had the horses ready when she came downstairs. 4 of them, his dark horse, a bay mare, he'd arranged through Harlan's stable hand the night before, and 2 borrowed road horses for Lillian and Sarah. He was checking the cinch on the bay when Maggie came out, and he looked up at her with the particular alert quality she had come to understand was simply how he was in the morning, fully present, no gradual arrival into consciousness, just immediately there. Sleep? He asked. Some. She took the reins of the bay. Sarah. Ready. She was up before me. He said it with something that wasn't quite admiration, but was close the recognition of a person measuring up to a hard thing. Sarah Brennan came out of the boarding house with Lillian 2 minutes later. In the gray pre-dawn light, she looked younger than 27, and simultaneously older. She had braided her fair hair back with a practicality that said she'd made her peace with the day's requirements and wasn't interested in ceremony. She looked at Maggie and gave one small nod, the nod of a woman who has already had the conversation with herself and come out the other side committed. Let's go, Maggie said. They rode. The road to Cheyenne was 2 days on horseback, one if you pushed hard, and had good animals, and didn't make mistakes. They pushed hard. The first hour passed in near silence, the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable, 4 people moving together at pace, each one running through their own version of what lay ahead, the horses' hoofbeats, the only rhythm. Then Sarah said without preamble from just behind Maggie's left shoulder, "He'll send men after us." Yes, Maggie said. How far behind? Garrett answered from the front. By the time Victor realizes we've left Cutter Creek, probably 2 hours from now when nobody he's watching sees movement. And by the time he decides on pursuit, rather than trying to work the legal angle, we've got maybe 4 hours on them. He didn't look back when he said it. 4 hours is enough if we don't stop unnecessarily. What's the legal angle? Lillian asked. She was riding with her back straight, in the way that meant she was holding tension in her spine and refusing to show it anywhere else. He'll try to have us stopped. Sheriff's jurisdiction ends at the county line, but Drake's reach doesn't necessarily end there. He has contacts along the Cheyenne Road, a way station at Redhorn Creek that I know for certain is owned by a man who owes him. Garrett paused. We'll go around Redhorn. That adds 2 hours, Maggie said. Yes. She absorbed this. The math of it, the injunction in 3 or 4 days. 2 days of riding, 2 hours of margin now being subtracted. The numbers had enough room in them. Not comfortable room, but enough. Go around Redhorn, she said. They were an hour past the county line into open territory, where the Wyoming sky opened up enormous and the scrub grass ran in every direction to the horizon, when Sarah came up alongside Maggie and rode next to her without speaking for a little while, which Maggie recognized as a person working up to something and respected by not rushing it. Can I ask you something? Sarah said finally. Go ahead. When did you stop being afraid of him? Maggie thought about it honestly, rather than reaching for the answer that would sound best. I'm not sure I have entirely, she said. I think what happened is I got angry enough that the fear had to share the space with something else, and the something else turned out to be louder. She paused. Does that make sense? Yes. Sarah was quiet for a moment. After I got to Laramie, and changed my name, and found a room in a boarding house where nobody knew me, I kept thinking that I would eventually stop feeling like he could still reach me. That there would be a morning when I woke up, and that feeling would just be gone. She looked at the horizon. It hasn't been gone yet. It might not be gone until you say it in a courtroom, Maggie said. Until it's outside of you and on record, and part of something real and official and permanent. She looked at her. That's my theory. I could be wrong. You're not wrong, Sarah said quietly. I can feel it. That's part of why I came. From the front, Garrett's voice. Riders! Both women looked up. He had stopped his horse and was very still facing north, which was not the direction they'd come from. Maggie pushed the bay forward until she was alongside him. She looked where he was looking. 2 riders on the far ridge moving parallel to them, not approaching, not retreating, just parallel. Drake's? She asked. Can't tell yet. He watched them for 3 more seconds. They're matching our pace. Lillian came up on Maggie's other side. If they're just travelers. Travelers don't match pace, Garrett said. Travelers go their own speed. He picked up his reins. We're going to move faster now. Stay with me. He didn't wait for agreement. He pushed his horse into a canter, and the others followed. And for 20 minutes, nobody spoke, because all their attention was on the 2 riders on the ridge, who maintained their distance, not gaining, not falling behind, just present like a reminder that they were being watched. Then the riders turned north and were gone. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Scouts, Garrett said, dropping back to a fast walk to spare the horses. Reporting our position. To who? That's the question. He looked ahead. Drake's men would come from the south and west. These came from the north, which means either Drake has men positioned ahead of us already or someone else knows we're on this road. Lillian finished. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes when a calculation suddenly becomes more complicated than it appeared. Shaw, Maggie said. Garrett looked at her. Colonel Aldous Shaw, Victor's partner on the land board. She felt the pieces settle into arrangement. Victor would have contacted him as soon as he knew the ledger was gone. Shaw has more reach than Victor. He has connections across the territory, not just the county. If Victor told him we're riding to Cheyenne with the ledger, she stopped. Shaw can't afford for us to reach that courtroom even more than Victor can. His name is in that ledger 23 times. 23, Garrett repeated. I counted. She held his gaze. We need to assume the road ahead may not be clean. He was already thinking through it. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, the way his eyes moved across the landscape without landing on any one thing, the systematic nature of a man who has learned to think tactically because at some point in his history it was that or not survive. There's a second road, he said. Rougher. It runs through the Laramie foothills, adds half a day, but it comes into Cheyenne from the east rather than the north. Fewer stopping points. Less predictable. He looked at her. Your call. Every hour mattered. Every hour was a shrinking margin between them and the injunction Victor was working toward through the county judge. Half a day was significant, but arriving in Cheyenne was the only thing that mattered. Arriving with the ledger intact, and Sarah Brennan still willing to testify. The foothills road, Maggie said. He turned his horse east without another word. They stopped once briefly at midday, not for rest, but because the horses required water, and ignoring that fact would cost more time than the stop itself. They ate standing up from provisions Lillian had packed with the quiet foresight that characterized everything Lillian did. Jerky bread wrapped in cloth-dried apples. Sarah ate methodically, and with concentration like a woman fueling a machine she intends to use. Maggie watched her, and thought about what she'd said that morning about waiting for the feeling of his reach to go away. About how it hadn't gone yet. Maggie understood this at a cellular level. She had spent 6 years managing Victor's reach, even in spaces he wasn't physically present in her own mind in the calculations she made before every conversation. In the flinch she had trained herself out of producing when he raised his voice. The reach of powerful men had a particular quality: it didn't require their presence. They built it into you. It lived in the reactions you had before you could decide to have different ones. The only reliable cure she had found was making them accountable in a room large enough and official enough and distant enough from their power that the reach simply ran out of length. That was Cheyenne. That was Judge Henry Wade. She looked up and found Garrett watching her with the steady attention he brought to most things. What? She said. Nothing. He looked away. Just thinking. About a pause. Ruth used to say before she came to Cutter Creek that she was tired of being careful, tired of making herself small so that things would go smoothly. His voice stayed even, but there was something behind it. I told her to be patient, that she'd find her place. He was quiet for a moment. She found Victor Drake instead. Maggie looked at him. You couldn't have known. No. He didn't say it as absolution, just as fact. But I knew what kind of world it was, and I told her to be patient in it, rather than helping her change it. He picked up the reins. I don't intend to make that choice again. She looked at him for a long moment. Something about this man, his particular combination of stillness and action, of economy and depth, kept catching her off guard. She had spent 6 years around a man who performed strength, and underneath the performance was mostly hollow. Garrett Hayes did not appear to perform anything. What you saw appeared to be the whole of what was there, which in her experience was either the mark of a genuinely simple person or a genuinely complicated one, who had decided simplicity was the most honest way to move through the world. She was increasingly certain it was the second. We should move, she said. They mounted and rode. The foothills road was harder, narrow in places, rocky, requiring the horses to pick their footing carefully. It slowed them. Maggie tracked the sun's position and did the arithmetic, and did not share the results with the others because the results were uncomfortable, and sharing discomfort that couldn't be acted on served no purpose. They were an hour into the foothills when Lillian, riding behind Maggie, said very quietly, "Don't look back immediately, but there are riders behind us." Maggie counted 3 seconds before she turned. 3 men, a quarter-mile back and closing not the parallel watching pace of the morning scouts. This was pursuit, direct and unhurried in the way that men pursue when they believe they have the numbers to be unhurried about it. "Garrett," Maggie said, I see them. He had already turned his horse and was reading the terrain, the instinctive tactical assessment of a man who knew how to think in 3 dimensions about landscape and threat and option. There's a narrowing about half a mile ahead, single file through the rocks. They can't come 3 abreast through it. That helps you, Maggie said. It also slows us. It slows us less than it slows them. Our horses are lighter and better rested. He looked at her directly. Can you ride hard? I was born on a ranch, Mr. Hayes. Something moved across his face. Then ride. He wheeled his horse, and they ran all 4 of them flat out across the rocky ground with the kind of controlled desperation that is not panic, but is the thing that lives right next to it and requires everything you have to keep them separate. Sarah Brennan rode like she'd said, like fear had decided to become fuel for her rather than wait. Lillian rode with her teeth set and her eyes forward. Maggie rode like the ranch land her father had loved, and Victor Drake had stolen, was underneath her hooves, and she was taking it back 1 stride at a time. The narrowing came up fast, a squeeze between 2 granite outcroppings, where the trail went to single file, and the footing required care. Garrett went through. First stopped on the other side and turned his horse sideways across the trail with his hand on his revolver. Keep riding, he said to the women as they came through. Don't stop. I'm not leaving you behind a rock with 3 men, Maggie said, pulling her horse up sharply. I'm not asking you to. His voice was calm. I'm asking you to get Sarah 50 yards further up the trail so that if this goes wrong, the ledger keeps moving. He met her eyes. 50 yards, I can see you the whole time. It was the right tactical call, and she knew it and hated knowing it. She looked at him for 1 moment, that particular look that carries more than whatever it would take to put it into words, and then she moved. 50 yards up, she stopped and turned her horse. Lillian stopped beside her. Sarah hesitated, and then, understanding the geometry of it, stayed also. Below, the 3 riders came through the narrowing 1 at a time. The first one came through at speed and found Garrett Hayes directly in front of him with the unhurried readiness of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. The rider hauled back on his reins. His horse skidded. That's far enough, Garrett said. The man was one of Drake's. Maggie recognized him at 50 yards a hand, named Pryor, who'd been on the Drake payroll for years. Pryor was not stupid. He looked at Garrett, at the position of his horse across the trail, at the revolver that was not drawn but was available, and he performed a calculation. The second rider came through and pulled up. The third stayed back, waiting to see how the calculation came out. You're obstructing men on legal business, Pryor called out. I'm sitting on a public trail, Garrett said. What's your legal business? Mr. Drake has an interest in the welfare of his wife. She left without... His wife is traveling freely on a public road, Garrett said, as is her right under any law you'd care to name. A pause. You're welcome to ride to Cheyenne by the northern road. This road's a little rough. Might not be worth your time. Pryor looked past Garrett up the trail to where Maggie sat on her horse watching. He looked back at Garrett. The third calculation he'd done since coming through that narrowing was the same as the first 2. This man will not move, and making him move will cost more than the benefit. Pryor turned his horse. He spoke to the other 2 quietly. All 3 of them went back through the narrowing. Maggie let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere in the center of her chest. Garrett came up the trail at a walk. He was entirely composed in the way that people are composed when they have been afraid and have not let it show, and she respected that with the bone-deep recognition of a woman who had spent 6 years doing exactly the same thing. They'll go around, he said. We've lost our time advantage. How much? They know this road now. They'll push hard on the northern route and try to reach Cheyenne ahead of us. His jaw was set. We need to move through the night. Lillian made a small sound that was not complaint, just acknowledgement of cost. Sarah said nothing. Maggie looked at the trail ahead, at the sky, at the mathematics of it all coming to its final shape. Then we move through the night, she said. They rode until the stars came out and kept riding. Somewhere in the deep middle of the night, when exhaustion had burned through every other sensation and left a strange clarity underneath it, Sarah came up alongside Maggie again. They rode in silence for a while. The horses were tired but steady. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah said. "Yes." "The night I left Cutter Creek, the night I finally ran, I had told myself I was going to go back. The next morning, I was going to go back and tell someone." Her voice was low and careful, like she was carrying something fragile. "I never went back." "You're here now," Maggie said. 18 months late. "You're here now," Maggie said again with a firmness she meant entirely. "There isn't a version of what I'm doing that works without your testimony. The ledger shows what he did with land and money. You show what he did to people." She paused. "Both parts are necessary. You were always necessary to this." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "He told me once, Victor, that the reason men like him were successful was that people like me always eventually decided that speaking up cost more than it was worth." Her voice steadied. "I want to make him wrong about that." "You already are," Maggie said. "You've been making him wrong about it since you got on that stage in Laramie." They rode into the outskirts of Cheyenne as the sky was beginning its gray pre-dawn shift, and Maggie felt the city around her like a change in air pressure, larger, louder in its sleeping quiet, more layered than Cutter Creek had ever managed to be. It was the seat of the territorial court. It was the place that existed outside Victor Drake's architecture of influence. It felt, after 2 days on horseback, like arriving at a different country. Garrett found them a boarding house on the east side, a clean, decent place run by a woman named Mrs. Aldous, who asked no questions beyond what was necessary and had the look of someone who had seen enough of the territory's rougher business that 4 tired travelers arriving before dawn barely registered as notable. They took 2 rooms. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed in hers and held the ledger in her lap and did not sleep. She was thinking about the territorial courthouse, about Judge Henry Wade, whose letter Garrett had been carrying for 6 weeks. About the specific technical procedural steps that stood between this moment, a woman sitting in a boarding house room with a stolen ledger, and the moment when Victor Drake stood in a court of law before a judge he had never thought to buy. She was also thinking, with a precision she didn't try to stop, about Victor's face that morning in the boarding house. The fear she had seen before he recovered it. The fear was real. That had been real. Underneath the suit and the controlled voice and the 20 years of accumulated impunity, there was a man who was afraid, who had always somewhere been afraid, and who had built an empire of other people's suffering as a structure to keep that fear from reaching him. She was about to dismantle the structure. The ledger was warm in her hands. 47 pages. Every name, every amount, every date. Victor Drake's handwriting implicating Colonel Aldous Shaw, implicating the county sheriff, implicating 2 territorial land board officials, implicating the judge in the next county over. And Sarah Brennan was 20 feet away in the next room, sleeping finally with the testimony that would turn every number in that ledger into a human cost that a court could not dismiss. A knock at the door. Light. Garrett's particular knock, she had already learned it without meaning to. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the frame. He had his hat in his hand, which she had come to understand was how he stood when he was being careful about something. "Got word from the front desk," he said. "Mrs. Aldous has a brother who works at the courthouse. He says Judge Wade is in session starting tomorrow morning. Docket's full, but Wade takes emergency petitions at 7 a.m. before regular session." Maggie straightened. "We can file an emergency petition, with the right documentation and a clear statement of why the ordinary timeline represents a specific legal danger." "Yes." He paused. "The injunction Victor's filing through the county judge, if it goes through official channels, it could theoretically be used to argue that any evidence gathered after a certain date is tainted. It's a long reach legally, but Drake's lawyers would make it." He met her eyes. "We need to be in front of Wade before that injunction lands in Cheyenne." "When does it land?" "Best case for us 2 days. Worst case—" He paused. "Tomorrow afternoon." Maggie stood up. The ledger went under her arm. "Then we're at that courthouse at 7, she said. "All 4 of us. Tonight, I need paper and ink. I'm going to write out the formal summary of what's in this ledger and attach the relevant pages so Wade has everything he needs to grant an emergency hearing before he opens the morning docket." She looked at him steadily. "Can you get me paper and ink at this hour?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was going to have to stop noticing quite so precisely, that quality of seeing something in her that matched something in himself, that recognition that kept arriving quietly and without announcement. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She moved toward the small desk in the corner of the room. "Get some sleep after. I need you sharp in the morning, Maggie." He said it with a particular weight, and she turned. He was still in the doorway, still holding his hat, still being careful about something. "Whatever happens tomorrow." He stopped, started again differently. "You should know that what you've done, what you've managed, getting the ledger, getting Sarah here, getting us to Cheyenne ahead of Drake's people." He paused. "Ruth would have—" He stopped again. She looked at him across the room. The lamplight was low between them. "I know," she said quietly. He nodded once. He turned to go. "Garrett." He stopped but didn't turn back all the way. "When this is over," she said, "I want to hear about her. Ruth. Not the case, not the evidence. Her. What she was like." She paused. "If you'd be willing." He was still for a moment. "I'd be willing," he said. Then he went to get her paper and ink, and Maggie Colton sat down at the desk in a Cheyenne boarding house and began writing the document that would end Victor Drake's empire of stolen land and silenced women, one precise, careful, devastating sentence at a time. Outside, Cheyenne was beginning to wake. Somewhere across the city, in its proper and official buildings, a territorial court was preparing to open its morning session, and 3 men on lathered horses were riding hard from the north, carrying an injunction that had not yet been signed for a woman who was no longer where they expected her to be. Maggie wrote until 4 in the morning. Not because it took that long. She was fast with numbers and faster with language, when the language had a purpose, but because she wrote it 3 times. The first version was too angry. She could feel the anger in the sentence structure, in the way she reached for the most damning phrase first, instead of the most accurate one. Anger made bad evidence. Anger gave lawyers something to pull on. The second version was too careful. She had overcompensated and drained it of the human weight it needed to carry, turned a record of crimes against people into something that read like a dry accounting summary. Judge Wade was a man, not a ledger himself. He needed to understand what the numbers meant. The third version was right. She knew it the way she knew her own handwriting, recognized it as the thing she'd been working toward. Precise where precision was required. Plain where plainness served better. And in 2 specific places, the account of Ruth Hayes and the account of Sarah Brennan, entirely unsparing about what a human being's suffering actually cost. She set the pen down at 4:12 and read it through once more without changing anything. Then she placed it on top of the relevant ledger pages, wrapped the whole package in the oilskin cloth Lillian had thought to pack, and put it on the desk where she would not have to search for it in the morning. Then she lay down on the bed, fully dressed, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested, which was a different thing and sufficient. At 6:15, all 4 of them were dressed and moving. Mrs. Aldis's brother had been right. The courthouse opened its side door at 10 minutes to 7 for petitioners seeking emergency consideration. The clerk who received them was a small, precise man in his 40s named Mr. Gaines, who had the look of someone who had processed enough human catastrophe that very little surprised him anymore. He took Maggie's packet without expression, read the cover summary with the same expression, and then read it again with slightly less of it. "You have the original ledger," he said. "Right here." She placed it on his desk. He opened it to the middle pages, looked at the handwriting, looked at the attached summary, looked at Maggie. "This is Victor Drake's signature." "On 47 pages, yes." Gaines looked at Sarah. "And you are prepared to provide testimony as a witness to events described in the attached account." Sarah had been standing very still since they'd walked in. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of a woman who has made her decision so completely that there is no internal debate left to generate movement. "Yes," she said, "I am." Gaines looked at Garrett. "And you are?" "Garrett Hayes. I'm the one who located the witness and can provide account of the investigative process by which this evidence was gathered." He said it with the flat, factual delivery of a man who knows that in official settings, economy of language is a form of respect. Gaines made a note. "I'll present this to Judge Wade before he opens the morning docket." He looked at Maggie. "Wait in the hall. This will take some time." They waited in the hall. The hall was long and official, and smelled of wood oil and old paper, and it was the kind of space that reminded you, if you needed reminding, that the law was a thing with weight and architecture and history, that it could be used for corruption, but had been built originally for something else, and still carried the shape of that original intent. Maggie sat on the bench with the composure of a woman who has used up her available panic, and is now operating on something quieter and more durable. Lillian sat beside her with her hands folded in her lap. Sarah sat on Maggie's other side and looked at the opposite wall with the focused expression of a person rehearsing something internally. Garrett stood. He stood the whole time, which was simply how he waited upright, facing out, positioned to see anyone who came through either end of the corridor. 22 minutes passed. Then the door at the end of the hall opened, and a man came through it who was not Gaines. He was in his 60s, gray-haired, with a deliberate way of moving that suggested a body that had once been larger and had redistributed its mass into a kind of settled, formidable density. He wore the plain, dark coat of a working judge, not the performance of authority, but the thing itself. He looked at all four of them with the direct, unhurried assessment of a man who has spent decades reading people in high-stakes moments and has gotten very good at it. "I'm Judge Henry Wade," he said. "Which one of you is Colton?" Maggie stood. "I am." He looked at her for a moment, not sizing her up in the dismissive way, in the way of a man who is deciding whether what he's reading in a person's face matches what he's just read on paper. "Come in," he said. "All of you." Wade's chambers were functional and densely stacked with documents in a way that spoke to genuine use rather than display. He sat behind his desk and set Maggie's packet in front of him and looked at them arrayed in the chairs across from him with the settled attention of a man who has cleared his morning specifically for this. "I've read your summary," he said to Maggie. "I want you to tell me in your own words, not legal language, not formal language, what this is and how it came to be in front of me." So she told him. All of it from the beginning. The marriage, the discovery of the ledger, the windmill. Garrett cutting her loose, the copies made in the boarding house in the middle of the night, the ride to Cheyenne, the men on the ridge. She told it plainly and in sequence and without editorializing, because Judge Wade had asked for her own words, and her own words were better than any performance she could have constructed. When she finished, the room was quiet. Wade looked at Sarah. "Miss Brennan." Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "Your Honor, the account attached here describes events you witnessed and experienced in Cutter Creek between the years of 1881 and 1882, including the death of Ruth Hayes." He paused. "You're prepared to testify to all of this under oath?" "Yes." No hesitation. "You understand that Victor Drake's lawyers will challenge your testimony. Your prior name, your relocation, your delay in coming forward, all of this will be used to argue your credibility is compromised." "I understand." Sarah's voice was steady and clear. "My credibility was compromised by fear. That's true. But what I saw is what I saw, and what happened to Ruth Hayes happened, and I was there. And I will say so under any oath you put in front of me." Wade looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, but contained somewhere in it something that might have been recognition. A judge who has heard a great deal of testimony over a long career and has developed a sense for when someone is telling the truth that goes beyond technique or training. He looked at Garrett. "You gathered this evidence independently?" "Yes, sir. Over 6 weeks across 3 counties." Garrett paused. "No official authority. I want to be direct about that. I was operating as a private individual with a personal interest in the outcome. Anything I gathered can be questioned on those grounds." "The ledger is Victor Drake's own handwriting," Wade said. "It doesn't require your authority to exist. It requires your testimony about the chain of custody." He looked at Maggie. "Same for you regarding the removal from the property. The property is in Victor Drake's name by a deed that is itself documented in this ledger as fraudulently obtained," Maggie said. "Colton Ranch was my father's land legally before it became Victor's by forged transfer." Wade opened the ledger to a specific page. He'd read it carefully enough to know which one. He looked at the entry. He closed it. "I'm going to grant an emergency hearing," he said. "Not a full trial that takes time to schedule properly, and Drake's attorneys will have the right to prepare. But I can convene a preliminary evidentiary hearing as early as tomorrow morning, at which point this ledger and Miss Brennan's testimony are entered into the formal territorial court record." He looked at Maggie. "Once it's in this court's record, any county-level injunction Drake files becomes legally toothless. It cannot reach what is already in evidence at the territorial level." Maggie felt something move through her chest. Not relief yet, because there were too many steps still ahead, but the first clear sight of the shape of what relief would eventually feel like. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Wade said with the particular dryness of a man who has seen enough of the law's complications to know that getting into a courtroom and winning in one are genuinely different achievements. "Drake will be notified that a hearing has been filed. His lawyers will appear. You should expect them to be aggressive." He looked at her directly. "Are you prepared for that?" "I've been prepared for it for 6 years," she said. Wade, almost not quite, but almost smiled. "Good." He stood, which meant the meeting was over. 7 a.m. tomorrow. Don't be late." They came out of the courthouse into the full morning light and stood on the steps for a moment in the kind of silence that follows something significant, the silence of a thing that has shifted irrevocably in a specific direction. Then Lillian said, "He's already here." Maggie followed her sister's gaze. Across the street in front of the hotel that faced the courthouse stood 3 men. One of them was Pryor, who had turned his horse at the narrowing in the foothills. One of them was a man in a lawyer's coat with the trim, prepared look of someone who travels with briefcase and purpose. And one of them was Victor Drake. He was looking directly at Maggie. The distance between them was perhaps 40 feet. In the morning light in a city street with people moving around them, he looked for the first time since she had known him like what he was. Not a powerful man standing in his own domain where everything answered to him. Just a man, large and expensively dressed and afraid, standing on a public street with his lawyer and his hired hand watching the thing he'd built begin to come apart. Maggie looked back at him without expression. He said something to the lawyer. The lawyer nodded and moved off quickly toward the courthouse, going to file something, to argue something, to do the particular damage that lawyers are hired to do when powerful men feel the ground shifting under them. Victor kept looking at Maggie. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She did not give him the satisfaction of any readable emotion at all. She simply stood on the courthouse steps in the Wyoming morning light and looked at the man who had tied her to a windmill 3 days ago and let him see that it hadn't worked. Garrett moved up alongside her. Not in front of her. Alongside. Victor's eyes moved to Garrett, and something in them changed a particular kind of assessment. The measurement of a man who has spent years identifying which people around him can be bought and which cannot. He looked at Garrett Hayes for 5 seconds. Then he looked back at Maggie. Then he turned and walked into the hotel. "He'll be on the wire to Cutter Creek within the hour," Garrett said quietly, "calling in everything he has." "Let him," Maggie said. It was what Lillian had said 2 days ago in the boarding house, and she meant it the same way now, not bravado, but the genuine assessment of a woman who has checked her position and found it for the first time in 6 years actually solid. The rest of that day was a different kind of work. Maggie spent 3 hours with Wade's clerk, Gaines, going through the formal requirements for the next morning. Which pages of the ledger would be entered as primary evidence, in what order, with what supporting documentation. She knew the ledger well enough to argue its organization intelligently, and she saw Gaines register this with the quiet recalibration of a man who had expected to be guiding an emotional woman through an unfamiliar process and found instead a woman who understood evidentiary structure and was not going to need guiding. Garrett worked separately. He had contacts in Cheyenne. He hadn't mentioned a former deputy marshal he'd known from his time working cattle drives, a man named Briggs, who knew the territorial court system and could tell Garrett which specific arguments Drake's lawyers were likely to deploy and how Wade typically responded to them. He came back in the early afternoon with this information and delivered it to Maggie without packaging it as more or less significant than it was. "They're going to argue the ledger's chain of custody is compromised," he said. "You removed it from a property legally titled to Drake. His lawyers will call it theft and argue any evidence obtained through unlawful removal cannot stand. Except that the title itself is fraudulent, which the ledger proves," Maggie said. "It's circular. You can't use a fraudulent deed to block the evidence of the fraud. Wade will see that. His lawyers know he'll see it, which means that's not their real strategy. It's a delay tactic. Their real strategy is Sarah." Maggie looked up from the documents spread across the boarding house table. "They'll attack her history," Garrett said. "The name change, the 18 months of silence. They'll argue she's either unstable or motivated by personal grievance rather than truth. Her personal grievance is that a man killed her friend and nearly killed her," Maggie said flatly. "That is not a disqualification. That is a reason. I know that. You know that. Wade knows that." Garrett paused. "Make sure Sarah knows that going in, because they're going to say it directly to her face in that courtroom, and she needs to be ready to hold her ground." Maggie nodded once. "I'll talk to her." She found Sarah in the small room at the end of the boarding house hall, sitting at the window. Not looking at anything in particular, just the way people sit when they're somewhere deep inside their own thoughts and the external world has temporarily become irrelevant. Maggie sat on the edge of the other chair and waited. Sarah came back from wherever she'd been. "Tomorrow?" she said. "Tomorrow." Maggie paused. "They're going to come at you hard. They'll use the name change, the silence, the time gap. They'll suggest you have reasons other than truth for what you're saying." Sarah looked at her. "Do you think I can hold up?" "Yes." Maggie said it without softening it into comfort, because Sarah didn't need comfort. She needed an honest assessment from someone who'd been watching her for 2 days and had formed a clear opinion. "I think you're one of the most fundamentally steady people I've met. I think you've been living with this for 18 months, and you know every dimension of it. I think when that lawyer comes at you, you'll find that having the truth on your side is not a small thing." She paused. "But I also think you need to hear that it will be hard. It will feel like being on trial rather than giving testimony. That's deliberate. That's what they're paid to do." Sarah was quiet. "Ruth would have been terrified," she said. "Ruth would have done it anyway," Maggie said. "Just like you." Sarah looked at her hands. "How do you know that?" "Because she was Garrett Hayes' sister," Maggie said simply. "And I've seen what that family is made of." Something shifted in Sarah's face. Grief and something warmer moving through it simultaneously. The complex weather of a person who loved someone she lost and is learning to carry both at once. "Okay," Sarah said. "I'm ready." The knock came at 9 that evening. Not Garrett's knock. Heavier, official. Maggie opened the door and found a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, careful suit. The specific kind of expressionless that lawyers cultivate as a professional tool. Behind him in the corridor stood Pryor. "Mrs. Drake," the lawyer said. "My name is Edward Cullum. I represent Victor Drake in this matter." "I know who you represent," Maggie said. She did not step back from the door. "What do you want?" "Mr. Drake would like to offer a resolution before tomorrow's hearing." Cullum opened a leather case and produced a document. "A formal deed returning the Colton Ranch property to your name, free and clear, along with a settlement payment of $4,000 and a dissolution of your marriage on grounds of mutual incompatibility." He held the document out toward her. in exchange for withdrawal of the evidentiary packet from the territorial court record. Maggie looked at the document. She did not take it. $4,000 was a significant sum. The ranch, her father's ranch, was the thing she had been working toward for 6 years. Both of them offered cleanly in exchange for the ledger. She looked at Colum. "What happens to Sarah Brennan if I take that?" Colum's expression did not change. "Miss Brennan's situation is not part of this negotiation. She's the only living witness to Ruth Hayes' death." Maggie kept her voice level. "If I withdraw from the hearing, there's no platform for her testimony. Victor Drake walks away, and Sarah Brennan goes back to living under a false name in Laramie, waiting for him to eventually find her. That's not—" "What happens to Colonel Shaw?" she continued. "To the county sheriff? To the 2 land board officials? To all 11 families who had their properties stolen?" She paused. "The settlement gets me my land back. It doesn't get any of them anything." Colum said nothing. "Take the document back to Victor," Maggie said. "Tell him that what he's offering is not a resolution. It's a transaction that benefits one person and leaves everyone else exactly where they were." She looked at him steadily. "We'll see him in court tomorrow." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for 10 seconds, breathing. The ranch. $4,000. The simplest version of the thing she'd been fighting for, handed to her with no further effort required. The version where she walked away clean and everyone else stayed buried. She had not hesitated. She needed to notice that. She had not hesitated for even a full second. Garrett was at the end of the corridor. He had come out of his room when he heard the knock, which told her he'd been awake and listening because that was who he was. "Drake's lawyer," she said. "I know. I heard the tone of it." He walked toward her slowly. "Settlement offer. The ranch and $4,000 for the ledger." He stopped a few feet from her. "You said no." "I said no." He looked at her in the lamplight of the corridor in that particular way of his that she had stopped pretending not to notice. There was something in his face that was not the quiet recognition she'd been cataloging all week. It was something that had moved past recognition into a different territory. Something that he was holding with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything, not suppressing it, just carrying it at the right distance for the current moment. "Maggie," he said. "I know," she said, which was not a complete sentence and answered nothing specific, and yet somehow said what needed to be said between 2 people who were in the middle of a thing too large to make room for anything else yet, but who both knew the thing was there, and neither of them intended to pretend otherwise. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too," he said. She went back into her room. She lay down. This time, she actually slept. 7 a.m. came cold and clear. The kind of Cheyenne morning that has no patience for hesitation. The territorial courtroom was larger than anything in Cutter Creek high-ceilinged formal, with the weight of its function built into every surface. It was already filling when they arrived, which surprised Maggie until Garrett said quietly, "Word travels in a city. A case against a man of Drake's standing draws attention." Victor Drake was already seated at the defense table with Colum and 2 other lawyers she hadn't seen before. Cheyenne lawyers, local men, which told her Drake had made calls through the night. He was in his dark suit. He did not look at Maggie when she walked in. He was performing the composed disinterest of a man who considers this proceeding beneath him, which told her everything about how frightened he actually was. Colonel Aldous Shaw was in the gallery. She saw him the moment she sat down, a thick-set man in his 60s, with the florid face and contained stillness of someone who is attending an event he is hoping very much to see go a particular way. He hadn't been summoned. He'd come on his own, which meant Victor had asked him to come, which meant Victor needed the visible support. She filed that away. Judge Wade entered, and the room came to order with the quick efficiency of a court that knew its own business. "This is a preliminary evidentiary hearing," Wade said with no preamble, "in the matter of a petition filed against Victor Drake and associated parties regarding alleged land fraud, bribery of public officials and related charges. The purpose of this hearing is to determine whether the evidence presented warrants a full trial proceeding." He looked at both tables. We will begin with the primary document. Mrs. Colton, you will walk this court through the ledger. Maggie stood. She walked them through it page by page. She did not rush. She did not editorialize. She read entries aloud in Victor Drake's handwriting, dates, amounts, names, properties, and she let the accumulation of it do the work that no dramatic presentation could have done as effectively. 47 pages of a man's crimes in his own hand, read aloud in a territorial courtroom, is a particular kind of devastation. It doesn't require emphasis. It requires only a clear voice and enough time. Colum objected 4 times. Wade overruled 3 and sustained 1 on a narrow technical point that cost them nothing of substance. Victor sat through all of it with his composed disinterest. Only once, when Maggie read the entry dated March 14, 1881, which documented the payment to the county coroner for a specific false cause of death ruling, did she see his hand on the defense table press flat against the wood in a small involuntary motion. She read the entry twice, clearly. She looked at Judge Wade, not at Victor, when she read it. Then Sarah took the stand. What Sarah Brennan did in that courtroom was not what Maggie had expected, and she had expected something substantial. Sarah sat in the witness chair with the straight-backed, clear-eyed composure of a woman who has made a decision so completely that the decision itself has become a kind of armor. She told her account without trembling, without dramatic pauses, without any of the emotional performance that Colum would have been able to pick at and call instability. She told it like a person reporting facts, which was what they were. Colum came at her exactly as Garrett had predicted: the name change, the delay, the personal grievance. He was skilled and precise, and he built his challenge carefully. Sarah answered each question directly. You changed your name after leaving Cutter Creek? Yes, because I was afraid Victor Drake would find me. So you were operating under a false identity. I was protecting myself from a man I had reason to be afraid of. That is what I was doing. Her voice did not waver. Would you like me to explain what that reason was, or shall we proceed? A ripple went through the gallery. Colum shifted direction. You have a personal grievance against Victor Drake. I do. And that grievance, my grievance is that I watched a woman die, Sarah said. Ruth Hayes, 24 years old. She worked at the same hotel I worked at. She died of what the coroner in Cutter Creek called fever. She looked at the court, not at Colum. She did not die of fever. I was there. I know what she died of, and I know who was responsible, and I will say it in full on this record if the court would like me to. Your Honor, Colum said. Let her finish, Wade said. Sarah said it. All of it. In full. On the record. By the time she was done, the courtroom was so quiet that Maggie could hear the clerk's pen moving across paper. Colonel Shaw left the gallery halfway through Sarah's account. Maggie watched him go, noted the door he went through, and passed the information to Garrett in 2 words. Shaw's leaving. Garrett was already on his feet. He went through the side door 30 seconds after Shaw, quiet, unhurried, the motion of a man who has somewhere specific to be and does not require anyone else's attention while getting there. Maggie turned back to the front of the courtroom. She kept her face entirely still. Wade was writing something on the papers before him. He wrote for a long time. When he looked up, the quality of his attention had changed. It had the particular weight of a judge who has reached a conclusion and is now preparing to state it. I find sufficient grounds, Wade said, to order a full trial proceeding on all charges named in the petition. In addition, based on the testimony of Miss Brennan and the documentary evidence presented, I am issuing an immediate order to detain Victor Drake, pending the setting of trial date and bail determination. He looked at the defense table. Mr. Drake, you are remanded. Victor Drake stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. He didn't overturn the table or raise his voice. He simply stood the way a man stands when he has decided to use the last of his controlled composure for something, and he looked across the courtroom at Maggie Colton. She looked back at him. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that was neither anger nor calculation nor fear. It was something older than all 3, Something that looked in that brief, unguarded instant, almost like the recognition of a man who had spent 20 years building a thing on a foundation of other people's suffering, and had just in this specific room heard the sound of it beginning to come down. The bailiff's hand came down on his shoulder. Victor Drake sat back down. And Maggie Colton, for the first time in 6 years, felt the full weight of what she had been carrying. Lift not gone yet, not completely, because there was still a trial ahead, and lawyers and complications, and the long, slow work of real justice, but shifted, redistributed, no longer hers alone to hold. Garrett came back through the side door, 11 minutes after he'd left. Maggie knew it was 11 minutes, because she had been counting not consciously, but the way you count things when your attention is divided between what is happening in front of you and what might be happening just out of your sight. The bailiff had Victor Drake in hand. Wade was issuing procedural instructions to the clerk. Colum was on his feet making objections that were going nowhere, and Maggie was watching the side door. Garrett sat down beside her and leaned in close enough to speak without being heard by anyone else. Shaw tried to reach the telegraph office, he said quietly. He was sending a wire to the county judge in Cutter Creek, trying to push the injunction through before word of this hearing reached him. A pause. Briggs was already at the telegraph office. The wire didn't go. Maggie absorbed this. Shaw, Briggs is holding him for Wade's bailiff. Obstruction of a territorial court proceeding. Garrett's voice stayed even. He made it easy. Argued with the telegraph operator about it loudly enough that 3 people heard him say Drake's name and the word injunction in the same sentence. He panicked, Maggie said. Men like Shaw panic when the structure they've been hiding inside starts coming apart. They spent so long believing it was solid that when it goes, they go fast. He paused. It's over, Maggie. She looked at Victor Drake across the courtroom, at the set of his shoulders, at the way his lawyers were huddled around him in urgent quiet conference, at the particular quality of a powerful man, discovering that his power has a specific and identifiable boundary, and that he has just crossed it in the wrong direction. Not yet, she said. But close. The trial was set for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks was not a long time in the territory's legal calendar, which Wade explained was a consequence of the documented urgency and the strength of the preliminary evidence, both factors that allowed him to expedite scheduling in a way that Drake's lawyers immediately filed a motion to contest. Wade denied the motion the same afternoon. Victor Drake was released on bail that evening, a sum substantial enough to signal that Wade understood exactly who he was dealing with, set at a level designed to keep him in Cheyenne, rather than riding back to Cutter Creek to dismantle whatever remained of his operation before the trial could proceed. 2 conditions attached: he was not to contact any named witness, and he was not to leave the city limits. Maggie was told about the bail conditions by Gaines Wade's clerk in the hallway outside the courtroom. She listened, nodded, and said, "Will those conditions hold?" Gaines looked at her with the careful honesty of a man who respects people enough not to tell them only what they want to hear. They hold as long as he believes the consequences of breaking them are worse than what he's already facing. A pause. Given what's in that ledger, I believe he'll calculate that they are. Good, Maggie said. She walked back out into the afternoon, and Lillian was on the steps waiting for her, and when Lillian saw her face, she let out a breath that seemed to have been compressed for days. 6 weeks, Maggie said. We'll be ready, Lillian said immediately. It was not a question or a hope. It was Lillian stating a fact she intended to make true through whatever means necessary, which was how Lillian had always operated, and which was one of the most reliable things about her. Yes, Maggie said. We will. They stayed in Cheyenne for 4 days after the hearing. 4 days of meetings with Wade's office, with the territorial prosecutor, who had been assigned the case with Gaines, going through the ledger entry by entry to build the formal evidentiary structure that would carry it through a full trial. Maggie sat through all of it with the focused, methodical energy of a woman who has been waiting 6 years for something to do and has finally found the specific task that matches her specific abilities. She was good at this. She had always been good with documents and numbers and the careful architecture of evidence. Her father had taught her the books, and Victor Drake had unknowingly given her 6 years to become an expert in reading the kind of financial records that corrupt men keep because she had had nothing else to do with her intelligence, and she had refused to let it go entirely dormant. The territorial prosecutor, a younger man named Holt, precise and methodical in a way that told her he'd been chosen for this case because Wade trusted his attention to detail, spent 2 full afternoons with her going through the ledger's implications. By the end of the second afternoon, he looked at her across the table with an expression she recognized as professional respect, arriving at an unexpected address. "Mrs. Colton," he said, "you understand the evidentiary structure of this case better than most witnesses I've worked with." "I've been living inside it for 6 years," she said. "That tends to concentrate the attention." Sarah met with Holt separately. Maggie didn't ask for details. What Sarah said in those meetings was Sarah's testimony, and Sarah's alone, and the privacy of it was something Maggie had decided to protect without being asked. But she saw Sarah come out of the second meeting with Holt standing differently than she'd gone in. Not taller exactly, more settled. The way a person stands when they have said the thing that needed saying in a room where it was being taken seriously, and the saying of it has made room for something else to exist where the weight of the unsaid used to be. "How was it?" Maggie asked. "Hard," Sarah said. "And good." She looked at her. Both at the same time. "That's usually how the right things are," Maggie said. Garrett rode out on the third morning. He told Maggie the evening before, came and found her at the desk in the boarding house where she was going through Holt's preliminary document list, which was her version of unwinding after the day's intensity. "I need to go back to Cutter Creek," he said. She looked up. The statement landed in her chest with a specific weight that she noted and did not examine immediately. "The ranch," she said. "The ranch. And the other families." He sat down in the opposite chair, not across the desk beside it, angled toward her in that way he had of positioning himself so that a conversation felt like a conversation rather than a confrontation. "There are 11 properties documented in that ledger. 11 families who had land taken from them. Holt needs statements from as many of them as he can get for the trial. Someone needs to go to each of those families and explain what has happened, what is happening, and what they need to do to get their land back." He paused. "That's not legal work. That's the kind of work that requires someone who can ride to a farm in the middle of Wyoming and sit at a kitchen table and explain to a widow or a family that there is a genuine path to recovering what was taken." He looked at her. "I can do that." She looked at him steadily. She understood the logic of it completely, and she did not like that he was leaving, and she understood that both of those things could be true at the same time, and that the second one was not a reason to argue against the first. "The trial is in 6 weeks," she said. "I'll be back in 4. He held her gaze. "I won't miss it." She nodded. "The Hendersons are in the ledger, page 11. They lost the South water rights in 1880. They have 3 children, and as of 2 years ago were still working the land because they didn't know they had recourse." She had memorized this. She had memorized all of it. "Go to them first. Amos Henderson is stubborn and he doesn't trust strangers easily, but he responds to directness. Don't soften. Just tell him what's in the ledger and what it means for his water rights." Garrett looked at her. The expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before. Not the quiet recognition, not the careful carrying of something at the right distance. This was something that had given up on distance as a viable strategy and was simply present in his face with no further management applied. "You've thought about all of them," he said, not a question. "I've had 6 years to think," she said. "Their names are in that ledger. They've been in there the whole time." She paused. "Go to the Hendersons first." He stood. He held his hat in his hand. That particular posture she had learned was his version of being careful about something. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the practical requirements of a farewell. "Maggie," he said. "I know," she said, for the second time. He smiled then. It was a small smile, the kind that happens before a person has decided to smile the unmanaged version, the real one. It changed his face considerably. "I'll see you in 4 weeks," he said. You said 4, she reminded him. 4 weeks. He confirmed and was gone. She sat at the desk for a moment after the door closed and did not go back to Holt's document list for approximately 5 minutes, which she considered a reasonable allowance under the circumstances.
Child pay.
She went home. Not to Cutter Creek, not yet. Not while the trial preparation required her presence, and Holt needed her accessible, but to the version of home that had survived Victor Drake's architecture of control, which was Lillian. They took a smaller room together in a boarding house near Wade's courthouse, and in the evenings, when the day's legal work was done, they sat together at a table, the way they had sat as girls in their father's kitchen, and they talked. Really talked the way sisters talk when they have been managing a crisis together, and the immediate crisis has passed, and there is finally room for the conversation underneath the survival. Lillian talked about fear, about the specific experience of watching her younger sister inside a marriage that was visibly wrong, and feeling the particular helplessness of a person who sees clearly and cannot act without making things worse. I told you to accept the proposal, Lillian said one evening, just said it plainly, sitting across the table with her hands around a cup of tea. I've thought about that every day for 6 years. You told me we had no other option, Maggie said. At the time, you were right. I was afraid, Lillian said. That's different from right. Maggie thought about this. Maybe. But we survived it. And now we're here. She looked at her sister. If you'd been braver, then I might not have spent 6 years learning every entry in that ledger. We might have tried something faster and less careful, and it might not have worked. She paused. I'm not saying your fear served us well. I'm saying what happened, and we're still here, and we still have each other, and the man who made us afraid is sitting in a hotel room in Cheyenne waiting to be tried in a territorial court. She picked up her own cup. I'll take that accounting. Lillian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What about after? After the trial. After everything. Lillian looked at her with the careful directness that was her truest quality. The thing under all the caution and the calculation, the fundamental refusal to look away from what was actually there. The ranch, your life, what you want it to be. A pause. Garrett Hayes. Maggie looked at her sister. I've watched the two of you for a week, Lillian said. I'm not blind, Maggie. Nothing has happened, Maggie said. I know nothing has happened. Everything is happening and nothing has happened yet, and you know exactly what I mean. Lillian's tone was not teasing. It was the tone of a woman who loves her sister well enough to say the true thing directly. He's a good man. Yes, Maggie said, simply and without qualification. The kind that's hard to find. Yes. Then don't, Lillian stopped. Don't manage it so carefully that it never gets to become what it could be. She set her cup down. You've been managing everything for 6 years. You're extraordinary at it. But not everything should be managed. Maggie looked at her older sister at the face she had known her whole life, which carried both everything they had survived together and everything that still lay ahead, and felt something in her chest that was not grief and not relief, and not the particular cold focus of a woman working toward a specific goal. It was something warmer and less defined and more her own than anything she had felt in 6 years. I hear you, she said. Lillian picked her cup back up. Good. The trial began on a Tuesday. The courtroom was full, not just observers from Cheyenne, but people who had ridden in from the county from across the territory. Families whose names were in the ledger, people who had heard something had shifted and needed to see it for themselves. The Hendersons were there. She saw Amos Henderson in the third row, a broad-shouldered man in a clean shirt that told her he had dressed deliberately for this, which told her everything about what it meant to him. Garrett was in the second row. He had come back in 3.5 weeks, which was 3 days ahead of what he'd promised, and he had not made a performance of this. He'd simply appeared at the boarding house door the previous evening with dust on his coat and the names of 9 families he'd spoken to, and handed Maggie a folded paper with their statements. 9 families, in 3.5 weeks, riding across Wyoming Territory in summer heat, sitting at kitchen tables, explaining to stubborn and frightened and grieving people that there was a real path forward. She had looked at the 9 names and thought about what that had cost him in miles and in the particular emotional labor of delivering hope to people who had stopped trusting it. "Thank you," she had said. He had looked at her across her boarding house doorway with the expression she now knew as his real face, the one under the management, and said, "How are you?" Not, "How is the case?" or "How is the preparation?" or any of the practical questions. "How are you?" "Better," she said. "Now." He had nodded once in the particular way of a man receiving information he had been carrying the question of for 3.5 weeks, and she had stepped back from the door to let him in. And they had sat at the small table, and she had told him everything that had happened in his absence. And he had listened with the whole of his attention, and it had felt completely naturally and without any ceremony like coming to rest. Now she sat at the petitioner's table and watched Victor Drake take his seat at the defense table and did not look away when he looked at her because she had decided months ago and in a different room that she was finished looking away. The trial lasted 8 days. Holt was precise and methodical and relentless in the way of a man who genuinely believes in what he is doing and has been given the tools to do it well. He walked the court through the ledger with the patience of a teacher and the precision of a surgeon. He called 11 witnesses, the 9 families Garrett had spoken to, plus 2 former county officials who had, once they understood that Drake's protection was no longer operational, decided that the calculus of honesty had shifted in their favor. Colum fought hard. He was skilled and he used every tool available to him. And there were moments in the first 3 days when Maggie, watching from the petitioner's table, felt the particular cold fear of a person who has committed everything to an outcome that is not yet certain. Then Sarah took the stand. She did it the same way she had done it at the preliminary hearing, with the clean, settled composure of a woman who has made her decision so completely that there is no performance left in it. She told the court what she had told Wade's office. She answered every challenge Colum mounted with the same direct, unhurried clarity. She did not cry. She did not dramatize. She told the truth the way truth sounds, when it has been held inside a person for 18 months, and has finally found the room it was always supposed to occupy, not loudly, not with excess, but with the absolute unmistakable weight of something real. When Colum suggested for the 3rd time, and with increasing desperation, that her testimony was motivated by personal grievance, Sarah looked at him with an expression that was entirely composed and said, "My personal grievance is that a woman is dead who should not be dead. You are correct that I have that grievance. I will have it for the rest of my life. That does not make what I witnessed less true." The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Wade did not need to call for order. The verdict came on the 8th day. Guilty. On all charges, the land fraud, the bribery of public officials, the conspiracy with Colonel Aldous Shaw, and the charge related to Ruth Hayes that had required the most careful construction of evidence, and that Holt had saved for last building to it through every prior piece, so that by the time it was named directly, the court understood with complete clarity what it meant and who it had cost. Shaw had entered a guilty plea on the 3rd day, having apparently completed his own calculation and determined that cooperation offered better terms than resistance. His testimony corroborated everything in the ledger, every name, every amount, every transaction. When the verdict was read, Maggie was sitting at the petitioner's table with her hands folded in front of her. She felt it move through her, the verdict, the finality of it, in a way that was nothing like she had expected. She had expected relief. She had expected the specific emotional release of a thing concluded after years of work. She had expected something dramatic. What she felt instead was quiet. A quietness so complete and so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to understand what it was. It was the absence of the weight she had been carrying. Not dramatic, not loud, just gone. The way you don't notice how heavy something is until the moment you set it down. She looked at Victor Drake. He was looking at the table. He did not look up when the verdict was read. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who had constructed an identity around being untouchable, and is now in this specific public room being required to exist without that construction for the first time. It made him look smaller, not because he had physically changed, but because the space he occupied in the room had contracted to exactly the space his actual body required, with nothing extra, No projection, no reach. The bailiff came for him. Victor Drake stood and was led out of the courtroom and did not look at Maggie as he went. She did not need him to. Outside on the courthouse steps in the Wyoming afternoon, with the whole sky open above Cheyenne, and the sound of the city going about its business in every direction, Maggie stood and breathed. Lillian came to stand beside her. Said nothing. Just stood there, which was exactly right. Then Sarah came down the steps and stopped in front of Maggie with an expression that was not happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for what was on her face. It was the expression of a person who has done the hard thing they were afraid they couldn't do, and found on the other side of it not just relief, but the beginning of a different relationship with their own self, the beginning of trusting it. "It's done," Sarah said. "It's done," Maggie agreed. Sarah looked at her for a moment. "What will you do now?" "Go home," Maggie said. "Get to work." Sarah almost smiled. "That's all?" "That's everything," Maggie said, and meant it entirely. Garrett came down the steps last. He had been in the back of the courtroom for the verdict. She had known he was there without looking the way you know certain things about certain people without requiring confirmation. He stopped on the step above her, which put them at approximately the same height, and he looked at her in the direct, unmanaged way that was his default setting for things that actually mattered. "Amos Henderson came to me after the verdict," he said. "He wants you to know that the South water rights are going to be restored. He's got the documentation ready to file with the land board." He paused. "He also said to tell you that his family has been dry farming that south pasture for 3 years because they couldn't afford to fight for the water." He said, Garrett stopped, started again. "He said his youngest daughter was born the year they lost the rights. She's never known that land with proper water. He said she's going to now." Maggie looked at him. Something moved through her that was bigger than the verdict, bigger than 6 years, bigger than the ledger or the courtroom or any single piece of the specific work she had done. It was the thing underneath all of it, the reason the specific work had mattered, the human dimension of what 47 pages of numbers actually meant when you translated them back into lives. A girl who had never seen her family's land with proper water was going to see it now. "All right," Maggie said. Her voice came out slightly uneven, which she allowed. "All right." Garrett stepped down to the same step she was standing on. He was close, not performing proximity, just present in the way he was present for everything fully and without reservation and without needing it to be more than it was right now. "The ranch," he said. "The ranch," she agreed. They had not talked about this in explicit terms. They had talked around it in the way of two people who understand the shape of a thing without requiring the ceremony of naming it. The Colton Ranch, restored by Victor Drake's own guilty plea as part of the initial negotiations that Holt had managed her father's land, her land back in her name. The deed had been filed 2 weeks ago. The paper existed. The land was waiting. "It's going to need work," she said. "Yes," he said. "The fences are down in the south pasture. The water system's been neglected for 3 years. Victor ran it on minimum maintenance after he took it. The east barn needs a new roof." She looked at him directly. "I know how to do most of it. There are things I'll need help with." Garrett looked at her steadily. "I'm aware of that," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Are you offering—" "I'm saying," he said carefully, and with that particular Garrett Hayes quality of choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, not slowly but exactly, that I came to Cutter Creek looking for something that's been resolved, which means my business in this part of Wyoming is technically concluded." A pause. "And I find I'm not inclined to leave." Maggie held his gaze. 6 years of calculating every word before she said it. 6 years of managing the distance between what she felt and what she showed. She had been so good at it for so long that the habit of it was almost structural. She set it down. "Then don't," she said. It was 2 words. It was the simplest sentence she had constructed in 6 years. It carried everything she had not been able to say in the middle of all the rest of it, through windmills and ledgers and foothills, roads and courthouse steps and settlement offers declined, and nights at a boarding house desk writing the document that ended a man's empire, and it landed between them with the clean, uncomplicated weight of truth stated in the right room at the right time. Garrett looked at her. The small, unmanaged smile appeared the real one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They rode back to Cutter Creek 3 days later. All four of them, same as the ride that had brought them to Cheyenne, except that the quality of the silence between them was entirely different now. Not the silence of people running from something. The silence of people moving toward something, which is a different animal, entirely lighter and full of a different kind of attention. Maggie rode with the deed to the Colton Ranch in her saddlebag. She was aware of it the whole ride, the way you are aware of something you have been reaching for so long that the arrival of it in your hand doesn't feel quite real yet. She kept reaching down and touching the leather of the bag, just briefly, just to confirm it was there. It was there. They rode into Cutter Creek on a late afternoon, when the summer heat had eased slightly, and the town had the quality of a place that knows something has changed, but hasn't entirely decided what to do about it yet. People came out of the general store, and the hotel, and the boarding houses to watch them ride in. Ellen Harlan was on her porch and raised her hand when she saw Maggie, and Maggie raised hers back. They stopped in front of Harlan's boarding house and dismounted. Sarah looked around the town she'd run from 18 months ago with the careful measuring expression of a person deciding in real time whether a place is somewhere they can be again. "You could stay," Lillian said to her quietly. "Cutter Creek is going to be different now. The sheriff's out. Shaw's plea agreement empties out half the officials Drake put in place. It's going to need people who know what it should look like." She paused. "People who won't accept less." Sarah looked at her. "You're staying." "I'm staying," Lillian said. "There's work to do here." Sarah looked at the main street of Cutter Creek for a long moment. At the courthouse with its painted sign. At the church with its working bell. At all the surface respectability that had covered the rot for 12 years and was now finally going to have to mean something. "I'll think about it," Sarah said, which from Sarah Brennan Maggie had come to understand meant yes. The Colton Ranch was exactly as she had left it, and nothing like she remembered it. It was the same place, same boards, same posts, same windmill that had gone still and then turned again and then become the site of the specific cruelty that had started all of this. But she walked through it now differently. She walked through it as herself, which was the difference. Not as a woman calculating her movements inside a space that belonged to someone else. As the woman whose father had built this place with 30 years of his hands and his intention and his love for the particular piece of Wyoming ground that it sat on. She walked out to the south pasture in the evening and stood in it and felt the ground under her boots. Garrett came and stood beside her. He had his hat in his hand. He was looking at the same horizon she was looking at, and for a while neither of them said anything, because the thing they were both looking at didn't require words to be understood. "Ruth would have liked it here," he said finally. "Yes," Maggie said. "She would have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told you I'd tell you about her when this was over." "You did," Maggie said, "and it's over." So he told her. Standing in the south pasture of the Colton Ranch in the Wyoming evening, with the sky going every color it knew how to go, and the wind coming back the way it had been coming back across that land for longer than any of them had been alive. He told her about Ruth, not the case, not the evidence, but Ruth. The way she laughed. The specific argument they'd had the last time he saw her about something so small he couldn't even remember what it was anymore, only that he'd been planning to apologize for it the next time he came to town. He told her about the morning he got the news, about what it had cost him to carry that, about the 6 weeks of riding 3 counties that had started as grief with nowhere to go, and ended on a ridge above a windmill on a July morning. Maggie listened with the whole of her attention. She did not look away from any of it. When he finished, the sky had gone dark at the edges, and the first stars were coming out, and the windmill behind them had been turning steadily for the last hour, which was its own kind of statement. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." "Thank you for asking," he said. She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had ridden toward her out of the dawn of the worst morning of her recent life, and cut the rope from her wrists with a pocket knife and a total absence of ceremony, and who had stayed. Through all of it. Not because she had asked him to, not because he had nothing else, but because he had looked at what she was doing and recognized it as something worth staying for, and had decided to be useful to it in every way he could. She reached out and took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers without saying anything, without needing to. They stood in her father's south pasture and watched the Wyoming stars come out one by one, and the windmill turned, and the land that had been stolen and recovered and paid for in ways that could not be fully quantified by any ledger breathed around them in the summer dark. This was not the end of the work. There were fences to mend and a roof to replace, and 11 families still in the process of reclaiming what was theirs, and a town that needed to learn what it looked like to govern itself honestly. There was a trial record in Cheyenne that would take years to fully unwind into its practical consequences. There was Sarah Brennan deciding whether to stay. There was Lillian already planning what came next with the focused, relentless efficiency that was her most essential quality. There was all of it still ahead, still requiring the best of everyone who had gotten this far. But tonight there was a woman standing on her own land, holding the hand of a man who had chosen to be there breathing air that belonged to nobody who wished her harm. Maggie Colton had stopped surviving the day Victor Drake tied her to a windmill. She had started living the morning she decided not to wait for rescue, and instead became the thing that could not be stopped.